Every empire leaves a record. Some records were never meant to be found. This is file No. 008. The record we were taught goes in a straight line. First, humans learned to farm. Farming created surplus. Surplus created villages, then cities. And only then, comfortable, settled, well-fed, did we build temples to our gods. That was the order. Food first, faith later. Then a German archaeologist stood on a hill in Turkey, looked at what hunter-gatherers had carved into stone 11,600 years ago, and the sequence fell apart in his hands. The hill is called Göbekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill, and what's buried inside it should not, by our own timeline, exist. Because someone went to enormous trouble to build this, and then someone went to enormous trouble to bury it. The question this file asks is simple. Why would you hide the thing you worked hardest to create? Let's fix the coordinates, because ancient is not a date. Göbekli Tepe sits on a ridge in the Germush Mountains, near the modern city of Şanlıurfa in southeastern Turkey. It was surveyed in the 1960s and dismissed. The visitors saw a slope littered with broken limestone and assumed a medieval cemetery. They walked past one of the most important sites in human history. In 1995, Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute, the DAI, looked again. He understood that the broken limestone was the story. He began to dig. He would spend the rest of his life on that hill. What his team uncovered were great circular and oval enclosures ringed by massive stone pillars. Not rough boulders, shaped pillars, each one carved into a distinctive T-shape. The largest stand over 5 meters tall and weigh in the range of 10 tons. Geophysical survey of the hill suggests there may be around 20 such enclosures in total, holding perhaps 200 pillars. Most of them are still in the ground, unexcavated right now. And here is the first fact that breaks the timeline. Radiocarbon dating places the oldest monumental activity at Göbekli Tepe at roughly 9600 BCE. That is about 11,600 years ago. Let me put that number where you can feel it. Stonehenge, the Great Sarsen Circle, was raised around 2500 BCE. The Great Pyramid of Giza, around 2560 BCE. Göbekli Tepe is older than Stonehenge by roughly 6,000 years. Older than the pyramids by roughly 7,000. It is older than writing. Older than the wheel. Older than worked metal. Older than fired pottery. The people who built it had none of those things. They were hunter-gatherers, using stone tools. So hold that image. No cities, no kings, no metal, no pots. And yet, carved stone giants arranged in rings on a hilltop. Who does that and why before they've even settled down? Walk into one of these enclosures, as it once stood, and you are surrounded. The pillars are not blank. Their surfaces crawl with animals, carved in relief and sometimes fully in the round. Foxes, wild boar, snakes, dozens of them, scorpions, vultures and other birds, aurochs, the huge wild cattle, cranes, spiders. This is not a farmer's menagerie of cows and sheep. This is a wild and often dangerous bestiary, the world of people who lived inside nature, not above it. And then there are the 2 pillars at the center of each ring. These are taller than the rest, and they are not just T-shaped by accident. Look closely. Arms are carved down their sides, bending at the elbow, with long-fingered hands reaching around toward the front. Some wear carved belts and what appear to be loincloths. The T is a head. These pillars are bodies, stylized, abstract, human-like figures. Schmidt believed they represented supernatural beings, or perhaps ancestors, beings of stone standing in a ring, forever facing one another. One of the most famous, known as the vulture stone, shows a bird with outstretched wings beside a headless human figure, a scene many researchers connect to death rituals, to the treatment of the dead. We cannot read it like a page, but it is clearly saying something. This is symbolic thought monumentalized in limestone at the very dawn of the Holocene. And every one of these pillars had to be quarried, carved, dragged and raised by people with no draft animals, no metal chisels, no wheels. Which means people had to gather, in numbers, cooperatively, repeatedly. And that is where the real revolution hides. Here is Schmidt's argument, the idea that made Göbekli Tepe famous. To move and raise 10-ton pillars, you need a labor force far larger than any single band of hunter-gatherers. You need many groups to converge on this hill. And when large numbers of people gather in one place, they have to be fed. There is evidence of exactly that. Enormous limestone basins, some holding well over 100 litres, and chemical residues that some researchers have read as possible large-scale brewing. Mass deposits of gazellebone point to great seasonal hunts and feasts. Now follow the chain. If ritual gatherings pulled crowds to this hill again and again, then the pressure to feed those crowds reliably, year after year in one place, could have pushed people toward cultivating the wild grasses growing nearby. In other words, the temple created the crowd created the hunger, and the hunger may have helped invent farming. And this is where it stops being poetry and becomes geography. Genetic studies of domesticated einkorn wheat trace its wild ancestor to the slopes of Karakada, a mountain roughly 30 kilometers from Göbekli Tepe. One of the founding crops of Western civilization appears to have been domesticated almost in the shadow of this hill. Schmidt compressed it into one line that detonated across archaeology. First came the temple, then the city. Not food, then faith. Faith, or at least the gathering, first. Now, the archivist does not sell you the clean version. Let's look at what the sources actually say today, because the story has been sharpened since Schmidt died in 2014. Schmidt's original strongest claim was that Göbekli Tepe was a pure sanctuary, a mountain temple with no one actually living there. Sacred and only sacred. That specific claim has been revised. As excavation continued under the ongoing DAI project, more evidence of ordinary domestic life emerged. Large numbers of grinding stones and household tools, and, importantly, rock-cut cisterns and channels that appear designed to harvest and store rainwater on the ridge. Water management suggests people were staying, not just visiting. Some researchers, including critics like Ted Banning, argued years ago that the temple versus house divide may be a false one, that for these people the sacred and the domestic might not have been separate buildings at all. They may have lived among their carved giants. So the crisp slogan, "A temple with no houses," is now too clean. The current picture is messier and, honestly, more interesting. A place that was both monumental and lived in. But, and this is the crucial point, the softer version does not rescue the old timeline. Even if people partly lived here, they were still at the start, pre-pottery hunter-gatherers, building monumental communal architecture before full farming economies were in place. The core inversion survives the correction. Large-scale, symbolic, cooperative building was underway at the very threshold of the Neolithic, not comfortably after it. Göbekli Tepe is no longer alone in saying this. Nearby sites, Karahan Tepe among them, part of a whole cluster now being excavated, are telling the same story across the region, which leaves the last, strangest fact. The one that opened this file. The enclosures did not simply collapse and erode, they were filled in, packed with limestone rubble, flint debris and animal bone, until the great pillars were completely buried. That is why they survived 11,000 years in such condition, and why the site looked from above like a nondescript hill. Schmidt read this as deliberate burial, an intentional act entombing the monuments. Others are more cautious and suggest slope wash and gradual infilling played a larger role than once thought. The debate is genuine and unresolved. But if it was deliberate, if a people carved these beings, gathered around them, feasted before them, and then, by choice, covered them over with their own hands, then we are looking at one of the oldest deliberate acts of remembrance, or forgetting, on Earth, and we do not know which one it was. So, set the file down and look at what it holds. Carved stone giants, raised by people we call primitive, before the plough, before the pot, before the written word. A hill that suggests we may have built our gods a house before we built ourselves a farm. A slogan that was too clean, corrected by the very scientists who study it. And a core mystery that survived the correction intact. And a burial nobody can fully explain. What Göbekli Tepe changes is not one date. It's the order of the story, the assumption that belief and gathering were luxuries that came after survival was solved. Here, it looks like they came first, or at least together. The record remains. Draw your own conclusions. This was file No. 008. The archive stays open. The next file in the Lost series is already pulled from the shelf. Subscribe and follow the Vellum. Some records were never meant to be found, and we are not finished digging.